Now, I'd like to, without taking any more time, introduce this morning's keynote. I'm very excited to welcome Ray Boisvert. He was previously the Assistant Director of Intelligence at CSIS, which is, I'm sure, a very exciting job, which he can only talk about a little bit, I'm sure. He worked in all facets of their operations, including head of counterterrorism, data exploitation, risk management, and finance sectors. He's now the president of ISEC Integrated Strategies, which is involved in building strategic relationships, including advanced surveillance and detection systems, as well as data solutions for both public and private sector customers. So I'm very excited to invite Ray on stage. Join me in welcoming Ray. Thanks, Ray.
Well, good morning. Bonjour. Pleasure to be here. I love the music. Feels like kind of a rock star moment, a little U2. We're just doing a quick technical adjustment here just as we begin. I'll give you a bit of context in terms of who I am, what I've done. Outside of the very eloquent introduction, I'm not a technical person. It's probably the best disclaimer right off the top. I'm really about people. I'm a firm believer that we're really in the age of that sort of a congealing of two important key factors, technology and people, all around this issue of interest. And the convergence of interest is really fascinating, especially in the context of people and technology. Plus, I'm a threat practitioner. I'm about understanding threats to national security, threat actors, and malicious behavior, because I'm a firm believer if you can figure out the thing about the threat actors and the malicious intent, you'll be much better positioned to apply the technology, deploy the defensive perimeter, and be able to look within your networks to better defend what's important, what's critical to your enterprise or your organization. So I entitled this today, New Era Risk Management, because it really is. We're in a new age. I started off in 1984 as an intelligence officer working in the Cold War era, and it was a time of incredible change. And it was a time where suddenly we were moving from the very rock-solid conflict between the West and the former Soviet Union, and we suddenly had to move quickly into an era of the age of terrorism, but I'll come back to that in a second. What I do believe as well, being a social science major as opposed to a technical person, is that ultimately history and context matter most as well. Again, back to my point about people and technology. So let me walk you through a bit of a story then about the Cold War. As a collection officer, as an intelligence officer at CSIS back in the early days of the Cold War, it really was about the classic spy versus spy, going after moles inside organizations, trying to recruit intelligence officers from the opposition, and of course the Soviet Union satellite states of Eastern Europe were part of that. This is one of the top spy chasers. This is one of the most important mole hunters in history. James Jesus Angleton was a CIA counterintelligence chief to 6 different directors of CIA. And during his tenure, he was able to convince all of those heads of services, and including the heads of services of all of the Five Eyes community, United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, that in fact there were moles everywhere, that all these organizations, due to some of the big defector sources like Anatoly Golitsyn, who explained that the Western intelligence services were so deeply penetrated that none of the work they were doing was effective or having any impact on the Soviet Union. So his legacy, and I existed in a realm and a time where he was actually having an impact even long after his death, and a fascinating man, award-winning orchid grower, award-winning fly fisherman, poet, author, but absolutely obsessed with the idea that there are persons in the environment who are willing and ready to betray the trust of others. So at the end, his legacy was destroyed careers, destroyed marriages, and really in organizations, or a series of organizations that were completely inward-looking and unable to move sufficient threat-related intelligence outside of their own organizations. Then suddenly, the Cold War came to a crashing fall, 1989, 1990, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, which led us then to the end of what that division of Europe was for such a very, very long time, and would define the character of enterprise, business, and government activities around the world. So let me just then give you a sense of what it was like as a young intelligence officer. Here it is now, 1990, 1991, and we're already seeing the early signs of terror, of the new form of state-sponsored terror moving into an area of ideological terror. Hezbollah was the first sign, 1980s. We had Terry Anderson. We had a number of Americans kidnapped. We had the bombing of the U.S. Embassy, killed 300 persons. Plus, there was a number of events, and we could see the beginnings of Shia-influenced extremism in that part of the world. In Canada, we had the Air India event, killing about 323, mostly Canadians, in 1985. A first sign of homeland issues touching us deeply at home and affecting our very way of life and our trust in the airline industry and understanding how security worked and how people would be willing to do horrible things in an interest or a cause. The USS Cole, the bombings, saw the first signs of early Sunni Islamic extremism out of East Africa. We had the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993 and how that changed a lot in terms of our understanding of how not only are they able to operate in foreign environments, but they're actually coming into North America. Then we had something that surprised everybody. We had Timothy McVeigh strike in Oklahoma City and created an event where everybody assumed once again that we had some foreign-based entity attacking the homeland in the United States. As it turned out, he was the pinnacle of what was then the right-wing movement in the United States, the militia movement and so on. And of course, by his extreme violence, he undermined that completely. Killed about 150 people, destroyed a daycare center, and so on. It was an amazing event that shook a lot of people up in North America. We had numbers of airline plots all over the world. We had a number of convictions, or trials, a number of convictions in various jurisdictions from the UK to Western Europe and North America. But then, of course, we came upon the quintessential moment that did, in fact, change everything, 9/11. And as an organization that was involved in threat-related intelligence gathering, we'd already shifted. When I first joined CSIS in 1984, about 85% of our resources were doing counterintelligence. By the time I left in 2012, 85% of staff were doing counterterrorism work because we ended up doing a couple things. The West became ensnarled in two horrible conflicts, one in Afghanistan following the one in Iraq. We ended up having events that involved extrajudicial activities or those that have seen now to have been perhaps questionable, and of course led to a lot of dissent within our societies, wondering what is the right level, what's the right tempo, what is the right level of activity in terms of taking steps to protect us from threats abroad without undermining the fundamental principles of democracy. So we ended up having new laws in Canada. We passed the Anti-Terrorism Act. We ended up doing the new Security of Information Act, which dealt with people trying to leak information. We had a number of convictions, and of course, around the world, a number of large, high-level terrorism cases and plots that were thwarted and successful convictions. But we had mostly, though, and this is what changed a lot of the context, is that perhaps the age of terror and perhaps the so-called war on terror was having a very disruptive effect within organizations and within the very fabric of persons who are trusted or entrusted with that mission. And Private Bradley Manning was the first to sort of demonstrate at the end of the day, not everybody sees the world in a very homogeneous way. And there could be within the perimeter persons who could betray that trust and bring the mission to a halt. Okay, so much for the context in terms of the early history. Let's move to what happened because of all that. So we moved quickly to a new realm. CSIS, the organization I worked for, ended up realizing in early days that it was no longer about that Cold War thing I mentioned about Angleton and the obsession about compartmentalization of information and securing things. At one point in those early days when I was at CSIS, the place was so secure that really very little good intelligence ever got out of the building. To suddenly we find ourselves now in the 1990s and beyond into the 21st century, out of the Cold War, and we need information moving at the speed of light. We need to turn open the taps. We have to empower our individual analysts with as much information as possible. Moreover, we have to start working more closely. We developed a doctrine of wherever the Canadian forces deploy, so shall we. Hence, our Afghanistan mission was born. We end up working with new partners to get new insights. The Communications Security Establishment, which is the Signals Intelligence Agency for Canada, the equivalent to the NSA, They became our eyes and ears in conflict zones, from Yemen to West Africa, the number of terrorism cases and kidnapping cases involving Canadians, Melissa Fung, Amanda Lindhout, Robert Fowler, Louis Gay, all prominent Canadians held in captivity from Somalia to Niger. And as a result, we ended up having to recreate and rethink the business of not only managing the threat, not only managing risk, but pursuing those who are out there potentially doing harm. And the biggest shift in the doctrine was, we shall engage the threat wherever it will emerge. And I think there are incredible lessons for that, which I'll come back to in a moment. On the domestic side, we had the RCMP having to change its methodology as well. We worked very closely together. We were able to come up with an approach to transition intelligence into evidence, which led to successful convictions, but also a stark reminder that there are things at home that could hurt. But sharing absolutely became the imperative. Sharing with partners, whether it's the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, the CIA, as the Secret Intelligence Service, but suddenly it involved emerging partners in Africa, in the Middle East, and elsewhere. And so my point out of this is that this is no different than managing a complex enterprise, a complex business environment, where the imperative is to get information out to the technologists, the engineers, the sales team, the marketing team, and it's about all those moving parts needing access to all of the information in real time without too many impediments. That becomes a big challenge. And that was the same challenge we faced, of course, in the intelligence community. Recognizing that there are two big problems. He was the first in the sense that he was able to get his hands on everything. Why? Because we wanted analysts to have access to all of the intel. The second part, though, became a little more complicated. Edward Snowden. A man who perhaps, and I'm not judging him, hero or chump, I don't care, but what he did finally bring to the forefront was the idea that ultimately insiders, the moles, as they would have been called during the Cold War, and the threat of them was alive and well. And organizations should pay attention to both the exterior, the perimeter of the environment, as well as the interior. There was a shocking revelation that I've admitted to since I left the service, is that espionage never left the scene. It wasn't as if the Russian intelligence service, the Chinese or Iranians or other services, or even some of our best friends and allies, because ultimately, countries have friendships, absolutely. They have trade agreements, yes, but mostly they have national interests. And they'll pursue those national interests as they see fit. And that means looking, and as the old statement goes, reading other gentlemen's mail. So espionage never left, but we had decided as a senior management team to purposely ignore it, because public safety was a far bigger imperative. It was much more important to protect people from the threat of terror, and hence that shift, that transition of resources of 85% from counterintelligence to counterterrorism. That left a lot of gaps, and that brought us into this absolute new full frontal assault era of a new threat. And let me give you some examples of what I mean by this new era of threat. One of the big shifts here is the issue of asymmetrical threat actors. And I've referred to this as the democratization of power. It's the ability of the weak to have disproportionate effect on larger entities and larger organizations. All of us have lots of guys and gals like him, lots of men and women who do things that are indispensable to the organization. They're talented, they're networked, they're engaged, but they are so rules challenged. They are so difficult to manage because of the sort of social context of which they've emerged. But they're absolutely paramount to the organization. If they feel that they've been wrong done by, they will hurt you later. Another great example is the Syrian Electronic Army. Now, I often think about them in ways that I think, okay, it's probably, I don't know, 10, and I'm just guessing, 10, 20, 30 people, probably in less than stellar connectivity conditions, in the sense that intermittent power, there might be in Damascus, they might be in Aleppo, intermittent internet connectivity and so on. Yet, despite the distance, despite the perhaps limited tool set, they've reached out and touched some of the biggest organizations, institutions in North America. Harvard University, they get behind the paywall of New York Times and be able to deface other things, plus stealing about 1 million credentials from Forbes magazine, just to make a point. And we'll come back to that sort of approach later. The most tragic of tragic incidents, Sandy Hook, where all those young children lost their lives. Aaron Alexis in the Washington shipyards. Now, this is the other type of asymmetrical threat actors. This is the case of people with whether it's mental health issues or some forms of instability or doctrine driving them to see or feel things. They have a disproportionate impact on their institutions or organizations. I won't even mention this man's name. I hate giving notoriety, but you remember the case in Moncton involving the shooting of RCMP officers. I will mention him because he's really, really an interesting case study. Anders Breivik in Norway, back about 5 years ago. He killed 69 young people on an island in Norway after he committed a bombing campaign in Oslo. I visited the Nordic countries and I challenged the Norwegian intelligence service at the time, and I said, there's no way this one man was successful in creating and executing this type of complex attack involving creation of police uniforms, weapons, multiple explosives, and the ability to be able to secure an island, get somewhere and kill all those young people. And they were absolutely clear. Yes, he was. He became self-radicalized. He invented his own pseudo-religion, this new Christian right-wing extremism, and he went after the idea that he himself had to save Norway from the perversions of socialism. We have anonymous, we have hacktivists and activists, we have a number of others within the environment who can really have disproportionate effect. If they think your organization is doing things that are adverse or against their value set, they will come after you, and they have incredible capability. There's a gentleman here, Graham, who ended up taking out the Aurora FAA Center just very recently in Chicago. Decided he was going to kill himself and was managed to disrupt about 2,000 flights that day. Asymmetrical impact of players. He could have probably just as easily done it from a connection point outside and hacked his way in or left the back door and did something to the SCADA or some other control system and took down the same or had the exact same impact. So at one time, it wasn't always that way. If I would have stood before you a couple years ago and being a member of the Five Eyes community, I would have said, there's only about 5 countries in the world that have the capability to develop the type of internet-enabled threats that will change everything. But over time, and through the development of the Advanced Persistent Threat, the APT, we not only able to deploy that as an intelligence community, and not only were others able to go after it and redeploy it and redevelop it, but it now has become a widespread tool set. And some were grown or developed at home and ended up just being as powerful, as equally powerful as whatever tool sets the nation states had created. Zero-day exploits were all part of that same methodology and tradecraft that would have been the exclusive domain of just a few of the most advanced countries, but no longer the case. Russia, absolutely. China as being one of the other big countries that do everything. But right now, it's as much about the organized crime element and this fact that it's about a number of very smart, enterprising individuals who are connected through cyber, in some cases not even meeting each other in person, and who are conducting low-risk, high-value crime through the internet using some of these tools, and in some places, and I'll come back to this issue about convergence once again, working at the behest or in the interest or at least the approval of the host nation. So right now we have a world where a broad number of countries have access to the greatest technology available to what would have been the exclusive domain of a few privileged in the past. So let's take a look at some of these actors and take a look at the convergence piece. I do worry about terrorists. I come by it naturally. I worked most of my life in counterterrorism, and I left the main branch developing and leading that struggle. Terrorist entities have looked at the internet the exact same way. When you have an organization today that makes almost as much money in merchandising, including about $10 billion a day selling oil, which is IS in Syria and Iraq, you know you have a serious problem because they will be turning that money and that revenue into a different set of weaponized capability, which will also involve the internet. And they'll be coming at us very, very soon. Hezbollah was an organization, I think back again to the 80s and to the 90s, and right in probably until about 10 years ago, would have been seen as a little bit more of a thuggish, brutish organization, but now they are, in my estimation, a very sophisticated counterintelligence and signals intelligence organization. And that's a sub-nation actor. That's an organization that has learned and developed its tool sets through others, such as Iran. Al-Qaeda, despite the loss of Osama bin Laden, is still as proficient and is still as important to the threat landscape and still continues to aspire to achieve the ultimate weapons in internet space. Anarchists, I won't dwell on that. We mentioned very briefly. Absolutely, I think the hacktivist threat is alive and well, and it emerges and disappears. We still have the issue of the individual hacker, that sort of lone actor, still he or she still living at home or doing things that I hate to say or sound stereotypical, but they do it for excitement. They do it for reasons they think are somewhat benign, but could have incredibly devastating effect. Back to organized crime, we have left the Al Capone era. It is very much a case of very, very detailed network, intricate systems that are targeting wealth. It's the old adage from the 1930s about why do you rob banks? It's because that's where the money is. Why do you work through the internet? Why does organized crime now exclusively target it? It's much lower risk, much higher yield, and because it's the skill sets are available for hire and easy to do. So espionage at the nation state remains alive and well. I don't want to mislead you. It's still a big factor. There are still efforts to go after national secrets, diplomatic, military, security, trade, investment, and so on. But ultimately, it's about countries that have state-owned enterprise, such as China and Russia, and countries in the Middle East, and countries in Asia, who will do anything necessary to give their state-owned enterprise all of the advantages in the marketplace. And they will use the security apparatus, the espionage piece, to do that. And of course, then there's the proxies. All those bots out there, all those little groups and individuals, they provide incredible leverage for nation states who are involved in espionage over cyber because it gives them plausible deniability and it gives them the best available skill sets at the lowest possible price point. So again, we see the commercialization of threat and the ability to see this way to touch so many points around the world through a number of different threat actors. So let's take a look at the environment. Let's take a look at the threat surface. I'll suggest that assets right now, especially through the internet in this new age, in this new era of threat, is all about attack vectors involving the internet. Those are the most prolific and have the biggest impact. They're after commercial information, they're after intellectual property, they're going after those things, the ingenuity, the innovation that allowed for Western hegemony for the last 300 years. They're going after these things in ways that, first and foremost, come back to markets. They come back to finance. The financial sector are very important and thankfully are probably the best defended. Other areas, of course, include technology across the board. We have everything involving, again, the latest innovations are critical. Resources. Going after the resources are important, being able to ensure that you have strategic access to those resources through merger, acquisitions, or purchase, but it's also about the underlying technology that facilitates the extraction of those resources. They're equally critical. So we're down to everything from agribusiness to mobile technology because it's both it's a key part of business, but also a great facilitator to getting at the intelligence or information you want to get your hands on. Let me shift quickly to some lessons learned from my time at CSIS and since I've left and working with various companies on things. There's a pathology. There's a consistency in the way these things work. And there's always this triumvirate of technology, the opportunity, and again, the interests all coming together. The Home Depot hack, I won't walk it through. Everybody's heard about this. It's just a question of how this came about in terms of a nation state using a proxy. And more importantly, as it's been determined more recently, the SVR, the Soviet Intelligence Service, not only used a proxy likely to get at this, or they provided a permissible environment that allowed this particular group to go out and collect all that very valuable, sellable information on the internet. But at one time, there were some red lines. Nation states used to sort of prohibit certain types of activities by those within their borders. And they did that because they didn't want to, for example, take down a huge financial market in the United States or take down one of the top 5 banks in Canada, the United States, or Western Europe, because that would have state-to-state consequences. From what I understand on this particular one, and given the new sanctions on Russia over the Ukraine invasion, those red lines have been erased. A lot of them have been. So be prepared. We'll see a lot more higher level, higher enabled, where not only are the states allowing these groups to do this, but quite often and increasingly, they're providing them the technology to be able to go after what they need to do. Sandworm being another great example of that. And in terms of the sophistication of technology, lasting for about 3 years, targeting everything from NATO to some of the most advanced areas of technology in Western Europe, and being so effective that ultimately the state has benefited from the criminal activity, and it's been a very, very comfortable existence. Multi-purpose targeting is another part of this, this great storyline that's emerged in the last little while. I'll present to you NASDAQ. There's been a couple of great reports on this. President Obama was briefed 3 times, I understand, by the FBI. In fact, it was the FBI that discovered this particular hack, which is usually the case, unfortunately. The state has the best tool sets to be able to tell a commercial enterprise or entity that they've been done. And in this case, NASDAQ was looked at as a very prime target for 2 reasons. And it took almost 3 years for the NSA, for the FBI, and the CIA together to figure out to 98% certainty the following. That it was Russian intelligence, that it was intended to do 2 things. To collect intelligence information that would enable the Russians to launch their new technology-focused market or bourse. And they were able to then go to an area where they've also left a number of neutron bombs. In other words, they were not only prepared, they needed to learn so they could do their own exchange, but they needed to be able to consider that in 5th dimensional warfare, where we're going to move from conventional war, that they needed the ability to say that in a heightened moment of tension or in a declaration of war, we're going to destroy some of the most important critical infrastructure in North America. And that would include the NASDAQ. And I would suggest to you it includes many, many more, and many of which I suspect we've yet to find. Just think of Stuxnet as a last moment on that particular issue. Whether the Americans, the Israelis, a combination of both, or others came up with that, it's a very, very stealthy, highest level of APT, one that goes after SCADA control systems, but ultimately now it's out there in the wild. It's been evolved, it's been sold, and there's probably, I understand, 5 to 6 variants of Stuxnet available currently on the open market. And one can imagine the impact. When I saw the Spanish train wreck about a year ago, the high-speed train that went zipping down, and it turned out to be human error, my first thought was exactly that, a Stuxnet moment, where somebody in a terrorist entity or somewhere else wanted to take out that train, take control of it, and run it off the tracks. And we're not that far off. So one of the flaws I've seen quite often is that people are looking in the wrong places. Most companies, most organizations have a tendency to look at the perimeter, the fence line. It's the antivirus, it's the firewall, it's the very traditional things of making sure that you have an old, it's kind of like they used to always accuse generals, they're always fighting the previous war. And I think we have a bit of that in our current cyber defense repertoire in terms of toolbox. We have a tendency not to think in modern terms, in the sense of modern terms being as early as yesterday. One of my colleagues in a foreign intelligence service said to me, in a very top one, he said, I always take the page 0 approach. It sounds like a 0-day exploit. He said, I always just care about the latest intelligence on the top of the pile at this moment in time. And I think that's part of the methodology that I would suggest that people have to start thinking about, is that you have to look at things in a way that recognizes the velocity and the incredible volume of intelligence and information that's available that's being used by your networks and being used to further the business, and to start thinking about it in terms of it's very likely that you've already been penetrated. You've been penetrated within by somebody, or you've been penetrated already from the outside, and of course, while you're always staring, looking outside the fence line to see if anybody approaching, in a stealthy moment they're already in, and therefore you've already been deeply compromised. But let's focus for a few seconds here on the issue of betrayal. Again, remember my lessons learned about the moles during the Cold War and the fact we've kind of forgot about that until the arrival of Bradley Manning and Ed Snowden. And back to my point about having somebody who's extremely talented, who's indispensable to an organization, again, that represents all of the really good things we need to be able to apply in terms of our skill sets. And then going back to Snowden, I want to give you just a second to look up at some point. Down the road, take a look at the BBC story on the port of Antwerp. And take a look what happened when an organized crime syndicate ended up using likely an insider to facilitate the attack, or they did a very brazen, very highly complex attack at entering the building, something that intelligence services would usually be very proud of succeeding in doing in terms of entering and placing bugs or devices or something. And they did that for, well, they've been trying to get at the network for a long time. In fact, they'd been able to get in through the typical cyber attacks, spear phishing, and other things. They were discovered a couple times, and it was rooted out of the system. So this time they thought, well, this is one of the most busiest, most highly valued ports in the world. And we have so many cargo containers coming in with all sorts of illicit goods, we need to get in there. So they mounted, again, a complex operation. I think an insider ended up coming inside the organization and planting in keystroke loggers and hardware that always kept the channel open for them to refresh, update the exploits, and to exfiltrate all the data they need. They moved the containers away from police and customs at will for a number of months until they were finally discovered in a physical examination. The other part of the sort of the unwitting part of that equation deals with social media. I'm a big fan of telling my clients, because of my experience inside, we were very big at managing identity. We realized our officers were at incredible peril if they went out on a covert assignment, yet their fingerprints, they were no longer really John Smith. They had always been John Adams. Mary Smith had never really existed, and that was pretty easy to find out by doing just some fairly simple searching and see how quickly her identity had been built over time, and to get a sense that this is completely false, this is a false front. So social media has left so many open things. I also do it for business intelligence for clients looking at the competitive environment and getting a quick scan of how much people are paying their engineers or how much they're paying their designers or how much people are getting along or not. Just spend some time on Twitter, spend some time on Facebook, and take a look at what people are saying about themselves, about their colleagues, about their bosses, and you will find the threads that'll lead to a most successful spear phishing campaign, because companies feel it's beyond them to tell people how to manage their lives. I agree. But there certainly is great value in educating the workforce that are in your environments about all these combined threats. Nothing is isolated anymore. There's no isolated element within our environments. Everything is now completely interconnected. It's both the beauty and the curse. So ultimately, I've learned through all this is that, and I've done it before, and I did it professionally as an intelligence officer in terms of exploitation of our targets, but also looking now, we've seen the example of Target Store. Supply chain matters as well. They're part of that complex, interconnected environment, as are your employees, because they're now the new threat vector of choice, because they're easy. The larger entities, there's a large defense contract in the US I've had many conversations with. They have 500 companies in their supply chain that they have to manage to the same standard to ensure they will not lose those contracts and their certification. And that's replicated throughout a great number of industries and probably affecting everybody in this room. Targeting is key. There are smart threat actors out there, and they're using all these tools to be able to target your organization. And they're doing it in a way that I used to call it the discipline of intelligence, the discipline of an intelligence service, of investigative collective approaches. And that's what's being applied right now in the threat environment against your organizations. New society. This is another part about the threats within. We have to recognize there's been tremendous cultural and generational shifts too in the last 20 years. We have also a workforce that's much younger, they're networked, they're engaged, they're citizens of the world. They're very intolerant to a number of things that are great, less racism, less homophobia, and so on, but they're also very questioning about authority. And no longer is that sort of an easy pass or an easy granting of authority within the hierarchy of an organization. They have to believe in leadership, and I'll come back to that in a second. There's also, since the 2008 downturn, a big impact in our society and our civilization. There is a democratic deficit. It's growing. There's more things that are being challenged and questioned. History is always now on trial. We also have the issue of people, I think the issue of conspiracies are out of control. People are questioning and thinking they're conspiracies that have created every moment in history. You have famous politicians, vice presidential hopefuls that have been defrocked because they were found to have been cheating and been involved in criminal activities. We have 100 officers in the United States Air Force Academy who are involved in silo management in terms of those who hold the keys for nuclear silos, cheating on their exams. Why? Well, it's a shift. It's a highly competitive world, and people feel that if I don't get ahead, somebody else will. Equally, about 50 officers at the U.S. Naval Propulsion Center, the training school. Same thing, cheating on their exams. So I would suggest that we're living, as much as anything else, in this whole new age where cynicism is almost cool. It's part of the fabric now. It's one that we must recognize and manage, and just let it be what it is. The best way to manage it is through leadership. One of the best lessons learned from my experience in the intelligence community is leadership is everything. In military, paramilitary organizations, intelligence organizations, people will do incredible things of valor or take on some incredible challenges. I think of the young officers. When I was in counterterrorism, 80 some odd, I think at the peak, 86% of my officers had less than 2 years service. They were part of that cohort that I just talked about. It was a wonderful challenge and an exceptional success because we had very talented people. All they asked for in return was leadership and clear vision, clear set of requirements, clear processes, and from that, you will build trust. And if organizations have high levels of trust, they will have far, far fewer events of betrayal. And you'll have far fewer of the Snowden moments of the Mannings and others. And I think that's part of that resilient fabric that organizations have to consider. It has to be almost akin to this band of brothers. People have to feel that they're part of that organization. They have to feel part of your organization. If not, they will not be as productive, they will not be as effective, and they certainly will feel that at a certain point in time that they're about to be jettisoned, or they have been maltreated, or they have felt a lack of respect. They may, at some point down the road, hurt you now or hurt you later. So what's necessary to succeed in today's world? Well, again, I turn back to my experience. I think, well, innovation was key. We were drowning. We had all these massive pipes. This is the beauty of the age of the internet. We suddenly got everything we wanted and wished for, as I guess in some ways Ed Snowden suggested that the intelligence or security community was out of control. But through that, we were drowning in information. We were drowning in intelligence, and our analysts couldn't keep up. Just the messages coming in from a couple of our key Five Eyes partners like the CIA was enough to completely overwhelm a desk head. So the only solution we had was to innovate, entrust people, give them the tools they need, but also the fact that we needed to let them be creative. And we, for example, at one point we developed a quick wiki. We just told everybody, here's a wiki, build your new case management tools as you would like to see them. Just follow 3 basic rules. And we laid that out, and it worked out marvelously. We entrusted and we empowered them to do their jobs. But the challenge process is equally important. This is the horrific moment. You've seen it probably in the movie Zero Dark 30. This is a replication of the Coast bombing. This is where the CIA station made some terrible decisions in judgment, killing 7 CIA officers and killing 2 contractors. They recruited a Jordanian intelligence officer who was playing as a double agent. As it turned out, he was a double agent, but going in the wrong direction. And he detonated an explosive within the compound, killing everybody within close proximity. That's the complacency moment. That's the moment of misjudgment. And that's where you must trust, but you must verify. And you must do your homework, because otherwise the consequences, as in terms of Elizabeth Curry, who was very, very well thought of, lost her life, as did the station chief and others, in the most tragic incident. So by doing these things, applying the innovation, being very clear on your challenge process and peer review, you'll get to a point where the prevention piece will be far less painful and difficult than the cure itself. And always learning, keep moving, always keep your things in a way that whatever lessons learned, and this is part of the process too, we would have some of our officers stand up in front of others and talk about a case, the good, the bad, and the really ugly. And do so very candidly so that people could learn about their environments and learn about the best processes and the best approaches to new target sets. Now, I just want to finish off, so I want to try to leave a few minutes for questions at the end, but let's talk about anomaly detection in terms of what we talk about trust but verify. I'm a big believer, again, I hate to always go back to my earlier business, but I learned a lot. I wouldn't have said the things I'm saying today if I would look back 20 years ago on how CSIS and how we did our operations. We're very parochial, we're a case-focused security service, very internalized. And then over time, because of the demands and expectations of the public, and I guess in your case, it could be shareholders, it could be the public, it could be regulators and others, the standard had to be raised considerably. So we had to get involved in what we call proactive defense, and that involved people as much as technology, as I said before. It's trusting people, enabling them, and giving them the right tool sets. But in order to achieve that right balance, what's really clear though, and I got this recently with a client where they had some betrayal. They had some of their people working outside in Asia and in Europe had got run amok and had betrayed the company. I took a look at their policies. I took a look at their rules of engagement. It was horrible. There were none. Where I worked, it was very clear. I was polygraphed, I think, 5 times, or had a lie detector 5 times over the last 7 years, because I was the most trusted person. Of course I was. But I was also verified, checked, and rechecked to make sure that I was completely validated in doing the work I did, and I had very clear rules of engagement. Everybody understood within the organization what's expected of them, and equally important, what are the consequences if you fail. And failure to do something right in the sense of a mission gone wrong was always forgivable. Failure to follow the rules of engagement, and whether it's betrayal or lying about an error, that was a fatal flaw, and we fired people very quickly. And that's, I think, the necessary threshold. So you always have to look at what people are doing within the organization, but do so very carefully. I wrote an article a little while back, it's called a delicate balance. Being very careful not to create an oppressive work environment where people no longer feel trusted, but they also have to recognize that somebody is verifying what's getting done. The counterpoint, though, is don't get caught up with distractors. I spoke last night in the national news about the tragic incident in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu and about the individual who ran over 2 Canadian Forces members. The challenge for the security environment was the volume and the lack of specificity. Too many cases, too many people. And one thing that I would have said is, I would add to the point is, I know these organizations are careful not to get caught up with distractors. In other words, following the wrong people. And that could happen, and maybe that was part of the decision point that led to this person not being detained earlier. And recognize that in terms of that ability to do all this, in terms of anomaly detection, you really need to apply smart technology. You really have to use advanced technology to be able, in real time, to ingest huge amounts of data without any latency, and to be able to look for anomalies within your networks. Accepting, again, the premise I mentioned earlier, that you probably have been penetrated. Those walls can no longer be successfully maintained. So if that's the case, then look at the predators from the outside that are within, and those who are already within, who are part of the enterprise, who may be involved in an act of betrayal. And the only way you're going to achieve that is through smart advanced analytics. And again, a high investment. So it comes down to really the best practices. It comes down to being thoughtful and rehearsing those, training people, and going back over them over and over and over again. I'll combine that with another element. I'm a big fan of that as your first best approach. That involves everything from the people, the training, the rules of engagement, the advanced analytics, to one where I like a good offense. Offense matters. And to do that, you're going to have to engage the dark web. You're going to have to go after those pieces and tidbits of information that are available out there, such as the fact there's a company in Montreal that sells exploits for as cheap as $2,000 or as much as $200,000. There are things out there that can hurt you, and you better find out what those are, because some of those will be tailored specifically to your industry. They'll know, and they're smart, they're learning, and they have adopted the lessons of a disciplined, intelligence-focused approach. Look at the way that various dump sites exist around the internet. And I had a case not that long ago where one of my colleagues sent me an email saying, by the way, I have the 1 million credentials from the Forbes hack. What do you want to do with them? Do you want to run some of the domains of some of your clients? I did. It was a Friday night, I sent him a BlackBerry message and went through and came back next morning. I had 20 for one company, 300 for another, 2 for one, 5 for another. It was amazing. So I reached out to the CEOs and the CIOs I've been working for, and I said, by the way, people in your company are using their domain, so Ray Boisvert at acme.com, to subscribe to magazines and do other things. Thankfully, 8 out of 10 got it and realized that that's just the next pathway into a deeper compromise for spear phishing and so on. But some of them came back and said, my CIO says, what's the point? What's the issue here? That's troublesome. So understanding about the dark web and going after information and seeing what other people are doing in social media as well. Take a look at sometimes what employees or others are saying about you. I mean, it's smart business intelligence, but it's also a good defensive approach as well in terms of your capabilities. And also then take a look at the idea that ultimately it's about who's saying what about your product, your service, your capability, or just the research and development you're doing, whatever the case may be. In that, you'll find some, again, business enabling insights, but you'll also get a sense of who now is selling your information or distorting it or causing some harm to your organization. So let me finish off with a couple of thoughts on what lies ahead. Well, I'd suggest certainly the potential for significant chaos. It'll be about data. It's all about data. You know that better than I. Most of you work in that environment. It'll be about financial markets as well. I think I see China's economic progress slowed again yesterday, and of course it affected markets. I am worried about the global economy because that, of course, I've tweeted out recently at ISECUS that it does matter. When there's a slowdown, it does affect the threat environment greatly. Critical infrastructure, everything keeps the heat on, the lights, money in the machines, steaks at the meat shop, all those things are constantly under threat, as I mentioned earlier, because they're fundamental to the existence of our society. I think there'll be a lot more disruption in terms of, due to the issues above, there'll be a lot more social unrest. There'll be a number of things happening. There's also a resurgence of right-wing extremism. There's a lot of anti-Semitism that's rising through Western Eastern Europe that's very, very ugly. Corruption, corruptive practices, they will hurt your organization. I help companies work on that issue as well, because it's so hard to understand and know who you're doing business with in another country, another environment. But also the fact that if your employees or somebody, even in a senior position, runs amok, it'll hurt. Resources, water, absolutely the issue of the next 20 years, and it'll be at an environment near you shortly. Conflicts in Africa, I didn't even bother mentioning the AIDS epidemic as another part of that. Canadians are also becoming deeply angst about identity theft, and they're thinking about all the things that matter to them because of Heartbleed and other events. And of course, haven't lost sight of IS and the Iraq-Syria situation. That's critical, and I think their capability will continue to grow because their sources of revenue are at a state level. And they will be, they're still finding ways to recruit adherents, and I suspect yesterday's event in Saint-Jean may have fingerprints of that. I am worried about the social license issue. How much social license is legitimate? How much goes to the point of becoming extreme activism that takes upon themselves the rule of law or the social barometer and decides that you are antithetical to a successful society, and they will take you down. I think extremism, especially religious, political extremism, is extremely hurtful, and it'll continue to spin out. We've yet to see it crest. And I think ultimately, how do we accommodate with the rising China? China, where we're in a multipolar world, where clearly Western hegemony is under significant threat. In fact, it's probably in some ways been greatly, almost completely undermined. It's not just China, though, there are other countries as well. But ultimately, and this is the core of the work of everybody in this room, I'm sure has some very deep interests, is that it is really about cyber. Cyber threats are the most important things that matter to this new age or new era of threats. And they are really, really critical for our sustainability as society, sustainability as organizations, and so on. I'll finish off with the very last slide here. I just want to give you a sense of, I don't want to leave you, my wife accuses me of working in the fear industry, so I want to make sure that I've done more than just sort of give you a sense of peril. But I'm hopefully all through my talk this morning, I was also give you a sense of there are great mitigation strategies, and they're actually very simple, as hopefully you've seen in the slides. But let me just go back over a couple of things. Multipolar world, absolutely of highly competitive nature. People are involved in things, they're going after things that matter most to them, so it's protecting their interests, and it's going to affect your interests, whether from the inside or the outside. So companies, state-owned enterprises, individuals, all of which sense this hyper-competitive nature of the world today. The world of the asymmetrical threat actors, that disproportionality of effect. Small entities having a big impact on a larger organization, which would not have been able to occur a few years ago. So they are technology-enabled threat actors. They have this disproportionate impact on people, and of course, there's this issue of convergence. And that's similar to my example involving Russian state, the kleptocracy, the issues of some of the cyber groups out there who are enabled and allowed to operate, and now the ability to reach and touch anywhere without any rules. And then finally, there's a question of organizational sustainability. This is achievable. This is not something that's outside of your realm. But be focused on the malicious actors. People are focused in terms of the tool sets, yes. Invest in those. You're going to have to invest in your people. You're going to have the right kind of training, and you're going to have the right kind of analytics to ensure that your organization is very nimble and fast-moving and always staying ahead of the curve in terms of threats. So the environmental awareness piece is what we talked about this morning, is really understanding and managing and mastering your environment. Understand your domain. We would not launch an operation, especially in a hostile environment, without just completely going to school on where Yemen is, what Yemen is about, how do you get a source upstream into an organization. All these things took meticulous planning. The mantra was plan, 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 execute. And I think the same applies to your area. And then again, I guess it comes down to thinking proactively on countermeasures, going after the dark web, seeing what people are saying about you, and understanding what's happening. So your organization does not have to look apocalyptic in any sense. There is hope, and I'll stop there and take any questions over the next few minutes. I believe there are some microphones back there, or if you just want to stand up at your table and speak out loudly, I'll be happy to answer any questions. I know it's the first hour of a long conference, but happy to have a chat.
Hi.
Hi.
Firstly, thank you for your service. Question on attribution. We always talk about this IP address or that IP address is in some jurisdiction, and everybody goes, aha, China. I was wondering if you could give your take on it from your service before.
Yeah, I know China is probably the most obvious threat actor because of its size, scale, and scope. It's been accused, and probably rightfully, of being probably the lead entity out there that's been probably the most rules challenged in the sense that there are no rules. And I think it's a different perspective on things. It's a world where in a fast-moving and fast-growing economy, there's probably been a view that's been taken in some quarters that, well, if you don't protect your own information, that's your fault. But the state is sacrosanct. Don't come and spy on the state. But if your commercial information is not being well protected, that's your problem. There's a bit of that. But China's not alone. And China's not the only prolific collector of commercial information and intellectual property. Others have as well, and I think I've given you some of those examples with Russia and others. It comes down to now, we've seen in the post-Snowden moments where other countries around the world have said, well, you know what, our alliances and friendships are no longer the same. There have been rumblings in Brazil, there have been rumblings in Germany and France. Other countries are saying, yeah, we'll share intelligence with respect to terrorism, and we'll have in terms of other emerging crises from Ebola to maternal health, whatever the case, whatever issue is being driven as our Prime Minister drives that one. That's great. But I think when it comes down to state interest and coming down to that really, really challenging issue of what is a state-owned enterprise and what does it mean in a free market economy. And in short, in my view, it means that when that company has been set up to succeed or it's been given the orders to move forward in the global or international marketplace, whether that company is Chinese or Russian or Iranian or anything else, Saudi or any other part of the world, where they're state-owned enterprises, they will very likely benefit from the infrastructure of the security intelligence apparatus. Some have suggested, I'm not sort of concurring, but the rise of Huawei, the fall of Nortel, there's been a number of things like that that have been important in the sense of people at least questioning whether or not there's any sort of connectivity to those points. Ultimately, it comes down to this idea that states have interests and they will use all of the power. One thing, though, I would like to dispel, though, just to finish off on the answer on that one, is to say that there have been accusations that the West does it as well. I don't buy that. There are very strict rules of engagement in Western intelligence services because collecting commercial information was really not that valuable. It might help inform policy or trade policy for Industry Canada or for the U.S. Trade Department, but we could never really use it because who do we give it to? Do we give it to Microsoft or we give it to Apple? Do we give it to HP? Or, of course you can't. So therefore, it's not the same as it would be in an area in where there is totalitarian regimes, there's totalitarian capitalism, and where state-owned enterprises have all the advantages from finance to intelligence. And that's a very different state.
Hi.
Hi.
How do you see the role of government changing in this asymmetrical threat model?
I'm sorry, your mic's cutting out. Could you try again?
How do you see the role of government in this asymmetrical threat model that we face today, and the partnerships between kind of public and private organizations in North America?
Oh, very good question. Thank you. It's one where I struggled with. I was the lead briefer for CSIS for ministers and going out once in a while. In the Canadian context, CSIS is really, really limited because the law, the CSIS Act says, you do three things. You collect intelligence, you analyze it, and you give advice to government. And in fact, that's been defined as the federal government. So it leaves a lot of big gaps. It leaves gaps at the provincial level, the municipal level, and when you think in terms of the impact on the citizenry, it's probably no better ideal than locally. The other part, of course, too, is you have other areas where it becomes such a highly classified, what we used to call high-side intelligence, really highly classified stuff that's very difficult to deconstruct it, unpack it, and dumb it down to a level where we could actually share it out. So that leaves tremendous gaps for business. I was speaking at a Five Eyes conference in Los Angeles about 6 months ago, and I really got a clear sense of how much the community, the intelligence and security and police community are struggling with this. And I came back and told a lot of my clients, we're in this by ourselves. Don't wait for the cavalry to come riding in and going to rescue your organization. The nations of the Western world are very limited in terms of how they can help. But I do think they can do a better job, and I'll be the first to admit there has to be a more creative way, innovative way to get information out to people and share that out. And I also suggest perhaps people need to challenge that paradigm as well and get governments to supply increasing amounts of relevant information. Perhaps the last question?
So in terms of Western hegemony, don't you think it's really the dollar hegemony? And how do you see the dollar hegemony being challenged by cryptocurrencies? Because I've seen
sorry, can I just ask you to repeat that just a little louder?
Yeah, so you spoke about Western hegemony, but really it's the dollar hegemony we are talking about. And how do you see cryptocurrencies challenging the dollar hegemony rather than nation states like China and Russia? I think there's something going on way beyond China and Russia. It's the cryptocurrencies that are kind of, I would say, attacked from the side. What's your comments on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I think I understood the question. Sorry, the sound's not great, but I get a sense that we're at a moment where the whole construct, the whole Bretton Woods agreements after the Second World War, all those things are all coming to a new era. Those have yet to be worked out, and I think we're going to, whether it's currency, which country will have the global currency, will the US dollar be replaced? What about gold? What about bitcoins and all the spin-offs from that? These are all interesting questions. They're fascinating. I think only time will tell. Markets will drive most of that reality. At the end of the day, it's down to this idea. We've had Pax Britannica, where the UK ruled the seas. We've had Pax Americana since the Second World War. Now we're into a multipolar world, and it's in the early stages of this new chapter. And my only hope is that it doesn't get ugly, and that we all find ways to accommodate that growth and shifting and changing. But in between, there'll be a lot of spikes of violence, tension, stress, and positioning. And I think right now we're into probably a tumultuous decade ahead. Thank you very much. Well, thank you this morning, and hope you enjoy your conference. It's wonderful.